The infamous case of Dr. Harold Shipman, a legacy that shook the medical world. When the name Harold Shipman comes up, it sends an undeniable chill down the spine of anyone familiar with his story. Harold Shipman was far from the typical image of a British family doctor. Trusted, respected, and seemingly compassionate to those around him, Shipman was, in truth, one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. His dual life and the magnitude of his crimes tore at the heart of society's trust in the medical profession, unraveling deep fears and prompting fundamental changes in oversight and patient safety. To fully understand the shock that Shipman's crimes inflicted upon the medical community and the general public, one must consider the position he held within society. A family doctor or general practitioner, GP, in the United Kingdom is more than a healer. They're often a confidant and an integral thread in the community fabric. People sought Shipman's advice on everything from minor ailments to life-and-death emergencies. Families let him into their homes, trusted him with the care of their parents and grandparents, and believed implicitly in the oath he had taken to do no harm. Shipman began his career in medicine in the early 1970s, and soon established himself in the small town of Hyde, Cheshire. There he cultivated a reputation for being diligent and always available for his patients. Neighbors regarded him as calm, friendly, and entirely reliable. Of course, no one could have imagined what would eventually come to light, that this very reliability allowed him the access and means to commit his atrocious acts undetected for years. The heinous nature of Shipman's crimes is amplified by the overwhelming trust his patients and their families placed in him. People turned to him in some of their most vulnerable moments, when they were ill, frightened, or caring for aging relatives. To uncover that a beloved family physician could betray that trust so absolutely was devastating, not only for the victims' families, but also for communities across the country. The medical community in particular was shaken to its core. Doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers saw the trust of patients as sacred. For one of their own to violate this bond in such a grotesque way was almost unthinkable. The public shock was immediate and widespread when Shipman was finally arrested. News outlets splashed his face across front pages and led evening broadcasts. Families who had grieved what they thought were natural passings now revisited every memory of Shipman tending to their loved ones. Suspicion, sorrow, and disbelief rippled outward, with hundreds of families wondering whether their losses might be tied to his insidious methods. Within the medical field, there was a profound sense of self-examination and horror. Colleagues who had known Shipman were forced to question their own perceptions and the systems in place meant to protect patients. Up until then, the concept of a doctor as a serial killer seemed reserved for fiction or rare historical anomalies. Shipman's crimes shattered those illusions and forced the medical profession to confront uncomfortable truths about accountability, oversight, and the potential for unchecked power in the doctor-patient dynamic. Alongside the personal reactions came institutional reverberations. Medical licensing boards, regulatory bodies, and hospital trusts all re-evaluated oversight procedures. How could so many deaths have occurred under the care of a single practitioner without alarm bells sounding sooner? The fact that Shipman was the one certifying his victims' deaths only added to the shock and sense of collective failing. For the public, the betrayal reached beyond the boundaries of the healthcare system. The Shipman case struck a chord about the dangers inherent in trust and authority. News pundits and ordinary citizens alike debated how society should balance respect for professionals and institutions with vigilance and skepticism. Many older people began to worry about how easily they could be taken advantage of when at their most vulnerable. Families began asking more questions of their doctors, and a climate of suspicion tinged many more routine consultations. The sheer scale of Shipman's crimes was a source of endless disbelief and horror. Initial investigations uncovered over 200 victims, but the true number may have been much higher. The knowledge that so many lives had been stolen, not by a disease or accident, but by a deliberate act from someone sworn to protect, was almost too much to comprehend. Memorials and commemorations sprang up in Hyde and surrounding areas, but there could be no easy closure for so many families grappling with both loss and betrayal. Trust in the medical profession was undoubtedly shaken by the public exposure of Shipman's actions. Patient relationships that had been built over the course of decades now seemed more fragile. Doctors found themselves having to defend not just their individual decisions but their entire profession's integrity against a tide of suspicion. For years after Shipman's arrest, support groups for patients and families grew, aiming to foster dialogue and healing. The medical associations redoubled efforts to underscore the strict ethical standards, reminding the public and themselves that Shipman was the most terrifying of outliers. The aftermath of the Shipman case saw sweeping reviews and reforms across the UK's healthcare system. Death certification procedures were overhauled. There was a major review of how patient deaths were investigated, especially when under a single doctor's care. New laws demanded clearer documentation, better communication between coroners and GPs, and far more scrutiny of death rates, prescribing patterns, and unusual clusters of fatalities. In medical schools and hospitals, the legacy of Shipman remains a cautionary tale. Students are now trained not just in clinical skills but also in recognizing the signs of professional misconduct. Whistleblower protections were improved to make it easier for staff to raise concerns without fear of reprisal. Standards around the use of controlled substances, especially those like diamorphine, became far stricter. Every time a protocol is followed or an audit is conducted, somewhere at the back of healthcare workers' minds is the specter of what happened when trust was left unquestioned for too long. Ultimately, the shock of Harold Shipman's crimes wasn't just about the numbers or even the brutality of his actions, it was about the fundamental rupture of a sacred bond. About what happens when the one person you're supposed to be able to trust the most turns out to be the one causing the harm. The reverberations of that rupture continue to be felt to this day, and the shadow cast by Dr. Death will haunt the story of medicine for generations to come. The shocking scale of Harold Shipman's crimes, uncountable victims, and the quest for truth. When talking about Harold Shipman, the true horror surrounding his name goes beyond just the crimes themselves. It's the unimaginable scale of suffering he caused, and the persistent uncertainty about exactly how many people fell victim to his betrayal. Official inquiries concluded that Shipman murdered at least 218 of his patients, but many investigators, journalists, and grieving families suspect that the actual figure could be as high as 355, or even higher. This chilling reality forces us all to grapple with questions about how such a tragedy could be allowed to unfold, how many lives were truly lost, and why the answers may remain forever out of reach. First, let's explore where these numbers come from. The official tally of 218 victims was painstakingly compiled by an independent British government inquiry known as the Shipman Inquiry. This inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, was one of the most comprehensive criminal investigations in British history. The team combed through thousands of medical records, death certificates, toxicology reports, witness statements, and even exhumed several bodies in an attempt to identify victims and trace Shipman's methods. The result was a meticulous report, identifying those patients whose deaths could be attributed beyond reasonable doubt to Shipman's deliberate actions. However, establishing a precise number in a case like this is far from straightforward. The higher estimate, 355 victims, comes from a broader analysis that included suspicious but unproven cases. Many of Shipman's possible victims were cremated, making it impossible to conduct post-mortem examinations. Countless elderly men and women died under his care with causes of death listed as heart failure or old age, something not unusual for their demographic. Without the ability to review physical evidence, authorities were forced to rely on patterns and probabilities, knowing that each file represented a real person and a devastated family. Shipman's methods made it especially difficult to trace his crimes. He targeted individuals who already seemed vulnerable, elderly, often frail people whose deaths would not immediately raise red flags. He exploited the respect and authority granted to family doctors in Britain, using medical jargon and the trust of relatives to pass off sudden deaths as sad but natural. Because Shipman was frequently the sole certifying doctor, families rarely asked questions. If they did, he usually provided plausible explanations, insisting, for example, that a patient's diabetes or long-standing heart problems meant their sudden passing should not be considered suspicious. The numbers are further complicated by the passage of time. Shipman's killing spree stretched over more than 20 years, beginning in the 1970s and continuing until his arrest in 1998. During this time, medical record-keeping improved, but in his early years, documentation was minimal and sometimes incomplete. In several instances, possible victims were identified only through circumstantial evidence, a cluster of sudden deaths while under his care, or curious similarities in patients' medical histories. Family members, especially those who lost loved ones before Shipman became a household name, often didn't learn the truth until years after the fact. The first hints of foul play only emerged when funeral directors and local colleagues began to note an unusually high rate of death among his patients. Even then, the pattern was hard to confirm. Every doctor has patients who pass away. It was only when authorities matched death certificates and compared prescribing patterns that the true magnitude of Shipman's actions came to light. The emotional toll of these figures cannot be overstated. For every confirmed case, there are families haunted by forever unanswered questions. Was my mother really ill? Could my father have lived longer? Did we miss something? The difference between 218 and 355 is not just a statistic. It represents more than 100 additional people who may have had birthdays, celebrated holidays, hugged grandchildren, or simply enjoyed more time with their families. Investigators faced incredible pressure to bring clarity and closure, but absolute certainty proved elusive. Shipman's own record-keeping was careful to a fault. Many times he used legitimate medical diagnoses as cover for his crimes. Natural causes became his shield. The more the inquiry unfolded, the more it became clear that reviewing just paperwork would never yield a full accounting. Shipman's confidence grew as years went by, and his clinical, emotionless approach left few traces except for a pattern visible only in hindsight. The debate over the true total of Shipman's victims also has broader implications for the medical community and wider society. If the best detectives and professionals in the world still cannot say with confidence how many lives he took, how vulnerable are we all to similar betrayals? The Shipman inquiry didn't just count bodies. It prompted wholesale changes in how doctors' behavior is monitored, how deaths are certified, and how unusual patterns are flagged. Most strikingly, his case forced everyone, from lawmakers and journalists to ordinary patients and their families, to confront the limits of oversight in relationships built entirely on trust. Some experts argue that even the higher estimate of 355 might understate the case's extent. Shipman's easy access to the medical records and his authority in signing off on deaths allowed him to mask his actions with chilling efficiency. Had the pattern not been identified when it was, he could have continued killing for years more. And many believe he probably did commit more untraceable crimes during his early career when regulations were laxer. The effort to memorialize the victims revealed how statistics can shape and shade individual grief. Memorials in Hyde and other communities included names, ages, and the stories behind each individual lost, reminding the world that each victim was more than just a line in a report. Every time new evidence surfaces, whether it's a family member recounting their suspicions or records unearthed from dusty archives, it reopens wounds and reignites the debate about the real number. No matter how you count the victims, the story of Harold Shipman is one that chills and infuriates in equal measure. Historians, journalists, families, and communities continue to ask hard questions about his motives, his methods, and the lapses that let him slip through so many cracks. The fact that no one can definitively say how many people lost their lives at his hands is a lasting testament to the scale of his betrayal and the devastating impact of his deceit. Ultimately, what stands out is the lingering uncertainty, the cruel irony that, even after exhaustive investigations, countless interviews, and painful public reckonings, Harold Shipman's true toll may always evade final calculation. For the medical profession and the public alike, the lesson is painfully clear. Even a single missed warning sign can echo across generations, and some wounds never truly heal. The numbers may remain in dispute, but the scars, visible and invisible, are all too real. At 54 years old, Harold Shipman stood at a peculiar crossroads in both his professional and personal life, when police finally apprehended him for what would become known as one of the most devastating killing sprees in British history. To understand the significance of his age at the time of arrest, we have to explore the context of his long and seemingly unremarkable career, the trust he had earned in his community, and the broader implications of a man leading such a double life for decades. Shipman was not a young or inexperienced doctor cut down in the midst of a burgeoning career. He was, by societal standards, a mature and seasoned general practitioner, GP, someone who had spent more than 20 years building a reputation in the small, tightly knit community of Hyde, Cheshire. By the time of his arrest, many of his patients had known him for years, even decades, and entire families had cycled through his waiting room, from children with coughs and fevers, to elderly patients seeking comfort in their final days. This longevity, rather than just marking the passage of time, gave Shipman a powerful degree of embeddedness in local life. He attended community events, exchanged small talk with neighbors, and cultivated the aura of steadfast dedication that made what came to light all the more staggering. The fact that his crimes went undetected for so long is inseparable from the fact of his age and his professional status. Over the years, Shipman gravitated toward treating the most vulnerable. His patient list grew to include a disproportionately large number of elderly women, many of whom lived alone or had limited family nearby. These relationships, built over many years, gave Shipman opportunities to insert himself into every corner of his patients' lives. He was called not simply for checkups, but for moments of crisis, unexplained pain, trouble breathing, or the slow unraveling of old age. Each visit appeared as an act of compassion, while in reality, some of these visits became deadly encounters orchestrated by Shipman himself. At the age of 54, Shipman had become an institution unto himself. He exuded trustworthiness simply because of the accumulation of years, qualifications, and his calm, paternal demeanor. His experience instilled a sense of security in his patients, who could hardly fathom that a man of his age and standing would violate their trust so catastrophically. But age, as it turned out, only gave him more cover. His seniority made it even less likely that colleagues or authority figures would question his paperwork or motives. It was almost unthinkable to his professional peers that a man with decades of experience would chart a horrifyingly different path. The protracted nature of Shipman's tenure in the medical field helped him refine his methods. By his 50s, he knew how to manipulate paperwork, which diagnoses to sight, and how to reassure anxious family members without arousing suspicion. As deaths accumulated, the very fact of his age seemed to shield him. Surely these were all natural losses, the inevitable result of frailty and time. Shipman skillfully played into societal expectations about mortality and the rhythms of aging, projecting an image of someone simply helping his neighbors pass peacefully, rather than orchestrating their untimely ends. When the police finally arrested Shipman, those who knew him were stunned not just by the crimes but by their duration. How could a man in his mid-50s, someone who had been present at countless births, deaths, and milestones, have spent nearly half his life hiding something so monstrous? It became chillingly clear that his age was a double-edged sword. On one side, it was a marker of stability and earned trust. On the other, it was proof of how deeply he had embedded himself into the system, using his maturity as a cloak. Shipman's age at arrest also added to the sense of tragedy and betrayal in the aftermath. For the families of his victims, many of whom were themselves elderly or middle-aged, the contrast cut especially deep. How could someone who so closely mirrored their own experiences, someone who had lived through the same eras, walked the same streets and nodded hello from the same pews in church, turn out to be a perpetrator of such evil? For many locals, his age lent him the subtle power of familiarity. He was not an outsider but a fixture, impossible to imagine as a threat. In a broader sense, the fact that Shipman was 54 at the time of his arrest challenges assumptions about who is capable of committing terrible crimes. Serial killers are often imagined as isolated, antisocial figures on the fringes of society, their youth or instability making them more suspect. Shipman's case exposed a far more uncomfortable reality. Sometimes age and outward respectability are the very tools used to gain, and then abuse, power. His long career allowed him to weave a convincing facade, one that might never have crumbled if not for an unexpected clue. For the medical field, Shipman's age prompted agonizing reflection. How could a system designed to monitor doctors over time fail to see signs of impropriety? What are the risks when seasoned practitioners are allowed a degree of autonomy that shields them from scrutiny? Subsequently, the Shipman inquiry and related legislative reforms were influenced by the realization that experience and seniority are not unfailing safeguards. New protocols were developed to ensure that all doctors, regardless of age, are subject to the same level of accountability and review. Even in his later years, Shipman's demeanor betrayed little of his crimes. The arrest at 54 was not a climax forced by escalating recklessness, as is sometimes the case with younger criminals, but a patient unraveling of a meticulously constructed guise. It took an undertaker's suspicions and the persistence of investigators to look past his age and reputation. Ultimately, Shipman's story is a sobering reminder that trust, once given over the span of years, can be abused for just as long, and that vigilance must never wane, no matter how familiar or safe someone appears in their mature years. Harold Shipman's professional life revolved around Hyde, a seemingly unremarkable small town nestled in Cheshire, England. On the surface, Hyde represented the quintessential image of British community life. Familiar faces, close-knit neighborhoods, and a sense of camaraderie built over generations. Into this environment, Shipman arrived as the trusted family doctor, an authoritative figure who embodied the reassurance, knowledge, and comfort that people naturally associate with medical professionals. The path that led to this trust was paved over decades of attentive care, routine visits, gentle mannerisms, and deep involvement in every aspect of his patients' lives. In towns like Hyde, the general practitioner is more than just a medical provider. They become woven into the milestones of family histories, delivering babies, watching children grow into adults, offering solace to those grappling with illness, and ultimately being present at the struggles of old age. Shipman understood this dynamic intimately. He didn't just treat symptoms, he made house calls, sat for cups of tea with the elderly, and remembered the names and life stories of his patients. For many in Hyde, he wasn't just the doctor, he was a confidant, a steadying presence, and sometimes even a surrogate family member. The significance of this ingrained trust cannot be overstated. People in small communities tend to value personal connections, often relying on informal recommendations and shared experiences in choosing professionals who serve their needs. Shipman's arrival in Hyde coincided with a period when people still viewed doctors with almost unassailable reverence, a relic of a bygone era where physicians were regarded as pillars of society who could do no wrong. Over more than 20 years in this role, Shipman utilized every nuance of this expectation. It's important to recognize how Shipman's deep immersion into Hyde's social fabric made him virtually untouchable for so long. His clinic's waiting room was filled day after day with familiar elders, concerned parents, and busy workers, all of whom believed him to be a source of reliability and care. He participated in community events, donated to local causes, and even offered advice outside the clinic, further cementing his place in the town's collective consciousness. Patient stories from this period reveal a sense of pride and relief in having a doctor like Shipman, someone always on call, who seemed to anticipate their needs. He was known for his willingness to see patients at home, especially those who were frail or nearing the end of life. It was not uncommon for Shipman to attend to older patients in their final hours, promising comfort and dignity for both the dying and their families. These bedside visits, now shrouded in tragic irony, were once cherished as the hallmark of a caring physician. The families who trusted Shipman found security in his apparent professionalism and sincerity. He took time to explain complicated diagnoses, always answered questions patiently, and regularly followed up with concerned relatives. His medical knowledge never came across as overbearing. Instead, he projected a calm, approachable demeanor that seemed to invite honesty and foster openness. In a world where medical bureaucracy can feel cold and indifferent, Shipman provided personalized care that kept anxieties at bay. The structure of a town like Hyde, with its intergenerational households and tight circles of social interaction, further strengthened the doctor-patient relationship. News, gossip, and stories traveled quickly, and Shipman's reputation as an attentive clinician became lore by word of mouth. If someone in town praised Shipman's care, that endorsement carried weight well beyond a simple review. It represented the social trust of an entire community. These recommendations created a feedback loop, driving more patients to his door. Over time, Shipman's longevity in the town amplified this effect. New families were introduced to him by relatives and neighbors. Elderly patients who had seen several generations of doctors still clung to his advice, and even those who moved in from other areas soon felt comfortable placing their health and well-being in his hands. The lack of significant complaints or mishaps only made his reputation shine brighter. Trust, after all, is built through repetition and the absence of visible error. Ironically, the strength of this trust became one of the most significant barriers to detecting Shipman's atrocities. The very qualities that made him a beloved member of Hyde's social tapestry, the warmth, the familiarity, the history, rendered any doubts almost unthinkable. When someone so deeply embedded in the community begins to break its most sacred bonds, the cognitive dissonance is profound. For years, no one in Hyde wanted to believe, much less accuse, their devoted doctor of wrongdoing. Even when suspicions were whispered by a handful of locals or undertakers, they were easily dismissed as misunderstandings or bad luck. Shipman's ability to manipulate both social relationships and community perceptions was chillingly effective. He handpicked victims who were unlikely to attract outside scrutiny, primarily elderly women living alone or those without vocal advocates. When deaths occurred under his care, Shipman explained them with plausible medical diagnoses and managed the paperwork with bureaucratic competence. Within Hyde, it seemed implausible that these losses were anything more than the tragic but natural course of life. From a broader perspective, the Shipman case reveals how close ties within small communities can sometimes become vulnerabilities. The very closeness that enables neighbors to support one another can, in rare cases, become a cloak for deception and abuse. Shipman exploited this phenomenon with devastating skill, embedding himself so thoroughly in Hyde's social structure that, for decades, he seemed more like a guardian than a threat. As the reality of Shipman's crimes came to light, the shock reverberated far beyond the immediate victims. Families grappled with the dual trauma of losing loved ones and learning they had entrusted their care to the very person who had harmed them. The rupture in community trust left deep scars, ones that no amount of policy reform could immediately heal. In towns like Hyde, where everyone knows everyone, betrayal cuts especially deep. The aftermath forced Hyde to reconsider not just its faith in authority, but the very foundation on which small-town solidarity is built. People began to ask hard questions. How much trust is too much? When does loyalty become naivety? What safeguards can be put in place without destroying the sense of personal connection that makes such communities vibrant in the first place? In the end, Shipman's decades-long tenure as Hyde's beloved doctor serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the complexities of human relationships. The events forced countless medical professionals, patients, and community leaders across Britain, and indeed the world, to confront the delicate balance between trust and vigilance. Today, his presence in the story of Hyde remains a sobering lesson in how even the loftiest positions of esteem can be weaponized for harm, especially when shielded by the comfort of familiarity and the passage of time. The manner in which Harold Shipman selected and murdered his victims was as insidious as it was chilling, centering around one deadly instrument: diamorphine. Diamorphine, known in the United States as pharmaceutical-grade heroin, is an opiate-based painkiller primarily reserved for cases of severe pain, commonly administered to patients with terminal illnesses or chronic untreatable suffering. This drug, overwhelmingly powerful and fast-acting, became Shipman's tool of choice for a string of murders that would not only devastate families, but also expose alarming gaps in medical oversight. Shipman's expertise as a general practitioner granted him legitimate access to controlled substances, including diamorphine. In the context of palliative care, it was not uncommon for a family doctor in the UK to keep supplies of strong painkillers, especially for elderly, critically ill, or dying patients being treated at home. However, Shipman's handling of diamorphine was striking both in its calculation and its callous disregard for ethical practice. He expertly used established protocols as cover, with each prescription, each dose recorded as intended for medical relief, but in reality, many were intended as a fatal overdose. The administration of diamorphine is a delicate process, strictly regulated by health authorities in an effort to prevent misuse, diversion, and fatal accidents. Normally precise dosages are measured, reliant on a professional obligation to balance pain relief with patient safety. With Shipman at the helm, however, the system failed spectacularly. He prescribed and administered lethal quantities to otherwise stable patients who, while elderly or frail, had no clinical need to be receiving such doses. Shipman's confidence and calm bedside manner convinced relatives that these final injections were necessary and compassionate measures, not the calculated acts of murder they truly were. What is equally disturbing is how Shipman's knowledge of pharmacology allowed him to exploit not only regulatory loopholes, but also the trust inherent in the patient-doctor relationship. Diamorphine, when injected, acts rapidly on the central nervous system. In small, appropriate doses, it diminishes suffering, relaxing patients as pain ebbs. In the deadly quantities Shipman delivered, it caused respiratory depression. Breathing slowed, then stopped altogether, often so quickly and quietly that families hardly realized a final fatal transition had occurred before it was too late. Family members would frequently describe how their loved ones passed away peacefully after a visit from Dr. Shipman. These deaths often occurred in the comfort of the patient's own home, minimizing immediate suspicion. Because the victims were mainly older women or already considered frail, the context allowed Shipman to attribute almost every lethally rapid decline to the normal course of aging, heart failure, or other plausible but fabricated medical explanations. He was almost always the attending physician, which meant he signed death certificates and completed the necessary medical paperwork, thereby eliminating or redirecting scrutiny. Diamorphine was scarcely tracked in Shipman's day, and regulatory authorities largely placed their trust in physician honesty. Shipman kept detailed records and appeared methodical, feeding into the perception of a conscientious professional. In truth, he often falsified medical notes and destroyed evidence of his overprescription. If any questions arose about his stockpiles or supply, he could cite terminal patients or palliative circumstances, giving little reason for pharmacists or inspectors to probe further. As suspicions about his behavior grew in the late 1990s, investigators zeroed in on the unusually high rate of diamorphine prescriptions written by Shipman, as well as the demographic pattern of his victims. Most chillingly, forensic analysis later confirmed that many victims' bodies contained levels of diamorphine vastly exceeding both palliative and standard medical doses. When the Shipman inquiry was eventually launched, the meticulous review of his prescribing history turned up hundreds of inconsistencies and red flags. Family testimonies revealed eerily similar circumstances: patients who were vulnerable but not terminally ill, receiving unexpected visits from Shipman, dying suddenly and peacefully shortly after being administered what he assured were routine or necessary medications. Medical experts called to the Shipman inquiry were united in their assessment: the dosage levels reflected intent to cause death, not to alleviate pain. Diamorphine, in the right hands and under the right conditions, is a medicine of mercy. In Shipman's hands, it morphed into a silent clinical weapon of mass destruction. The psychological effect of his method cannot be overstated. Many relatives were present at the time of death, or had only just left the room when their loved ones passed away. They often expressed gratitude to Shipman for giving comfort, only later to be shattered by the knowledge that the very same act was the cause of death. It compounded their trauma and confusion, leaving them struggling with guilt for not questioning his medical authority sooner. In the aftermath of the Shipman case, the medical profession, and the UK as a whole, underwent a sweeping review of how opiates like diamorphine could be dispensed and monitored. Strict controls were introduced over who could access such drugs, how they should be recorded, and mandatory checks for unusual prescribing patterns. Today, computer tracking, multi-signature requirements, and regular audits are the legacy of the profound breach of trust Shipman exploited so fatally. In medical schools and in practice, Shipman's chilling misuse of diamorphine is now referenced as a case study in the importance of vigilance, checks and balances, and the sacred responsibility of every healthcare professional. The story is a reminder that even the most trusted individuals must be accountable to the systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, that medicine's greatest tools, if mishandled, can become instruments of profound harm. Demographics of Harold Shipman's victims: unveiling patterns and tragedies. Harold Shipman's years-long campaign of murder remains one of the most chilling chapters in British criminal history, not only for its sheer scale but also for the distinct demographic patterns among his victims. About 80% of those whose deaths have been attributed to Shipman were elderly women, and this detail, while it may seem at first glance to be a mere statistic, opens a window into the psychology of his crimes as well as the wider social issues his actions exposed. However, the diversity in ages among his victims, with some men and even relatively younger patients among them, complicates the picture and underlines the far-reaching impact of his betrayal. Why elderly women were the main targets. First and foremost, it is worth considering why elderly women were so frequently the victims of Shipman's murder spree. In the context of Hyde and small-town England, women in their 70s and 80s often lived alone, having outlived spouses or close family members. Many relied on their general practitioner for both medical attention and social contact. Shipman, as a family doctor, was not only accessible but actively cultivated a reputation of calm, reliable support. Over years, he built relationships with countless older women who viewed him variously as a protector, confidant, and healer. Within the societal framework of post-war England, elderly women, often from humble working-class or middle-class backgrounds, were more likely to defer to a doctor's authority. This deference was further amplified by generational values that prized politeness, trust in professionals, and reluctance to question medical advice. They were, tragically, ideal victims: isolated, vulnerable, unaccustomed to advocating in medical settings, and willing, often gratefully, to let their doctor make all the important decisions. Shipman's annual home visits, delivered with practiced warmth, would have seemed both routine and reassuring, the sense of security and exploitability. Shipman's ability to identify and methodically target elderly women was chillingly strategic. By selecting patients already advanced in age, he ensured that their sudden deaths would arouse little suspicion, viewed as sad but ultimately unsurprising passages of late life. When relatives did express concern, Shipman would explain away the death as a result of natural illness, often referencing pre-existing heart conditions, strokes, or simply old age. Because so many of his victims were already expected, statistically, to be near the end of their lives, colleagues and death registrars rarely felt the need to question the causes listed on death certificates. The exploitation went deeper. In small communities like Hyde, neighbors might help with the arrangements after a death, but few would challenge the word of a revered local GP. Shipman handled everything: the consultation, the prescription, the final house call, and ultimately the death certificate, thereby controlling every step. The absence of close family, or their unfamiliarity with medical nuances, made his word nearly unassailable. The outliers: men and younger victims. While most of Shipman's victims fit the profile of elderly women, statistical analysis and investigative findings indicate there were crucial exceptions. Notably, the youngest identified victim was a 41-year-old man. Victims in middle age or younger, as well as men, raise urgent questions about how Shipman chose his targets and what caused him to break from his established pattern. In the known cases involving men, most were considerably older, typically over 60, suggesting that Shipman still preferred patients whose deaths would seem plausibly natural. The inclusion of a 41-year-old, however, highlights either recklessness, unique opportunity, or a particular and unknown motive. Detailed records have never disclosed a comprehensive rationale for these deviations. Some suspects that in these cases, Shipman felt confident enough in his overall position to take greater risks, or simply saw an opportunity for a crime with minimal anticipated repercussions. In addition to demographic outliers, even many of Shipman's elderly male patients fit the same broader narrative of vulnerability: living alone, trusting implicitly in their doctor, and having health conditions that could serve as convenient justifications for sudden demise. Authorities believe that the ratio of men among the confirmed or suspected victims is likely underrepresented, as men in working-class communities tended to die earlier or seek medical attention less frequently than women of the same age group. Psychological impact on families and the community. For relatives of the victims, the pain was often compounded by the frustrating lack of answers. The shock associated with losing a mother, grandmother, or great-aunt was magnified when the news broke that their trusted doctor had deliberately taken lives. Many families expressed overwhelming guilt for not having questioned Shipman's authority sooner, as well as disbelief and anger that such atrocities could have gone on for years without interruption. As police and the subsequent Shipman inquiry began to unravel the details of his patient interactions, families of male victims, as well as those of the few younger patients, faced a particular kind of confusion. While most could at least intellectually grasp the reasoning for targeting elderly women, the randomness of other deaths made Shipman's actions seem all the more monstrous, breaking through the faint safety nets left by more visible patterns. Community reactions, especially among elderly residents, regardless of gender, shifted dramatically. Elderly men, too, began to question if their health complaints had been handled ethically, and local women worried that their long-standing trust in medical figures had been misplaced. A sense of collective grief descended on Hyde, paired with the paralysis of not knowing which deaths might have been natural and which the result of murder. In later years, public memorials reflected the full span of Shipman's victims, giving equal space to both the majority and the outliers, each loss a permanent scar. Professional reflections and shifting safeguards. Within the medical field, the demographic patterns of Shipman's crimes had profound consequences. Healthcare professionals were forced to reconsider how power imbalances between doctors and vulnerable patients, particularly women in late life, are reinforced by tradition and trust. Medical training now places far greater emphasis on patient advocacy, the importance of family involvement in care decisions, and the need for regular oversight in all deaths certified by a single practitioner. Additionally, the anomaly of the younger and male victims prompted renewed scrutiny of cases that might not fit traditional risk profiles. Shipman's willingness to occasionally step outside his normal pattern is now used as a cautionary lesson on the dangers of relying too much on profiling or statistical comfort. Detecting medical serial killers, experts warn, cannot rely solely on established demographic or clinical patterns. Broader implications and lessons learned. At a societal level, the demographics of Shipman's victims raise uncomfortable questions about care for the elderly and the checks built into the medical system. Are isolated seniors, especially older women, still at risk of being overlooked or taken advantage of, despite policy reforms? What avenues exist for families to raise concerns about death certification, especially if they feel out of their depth when dealing with doctors? The Shipman Inquiry, reflecting on these questions, pushed through a series of recommendations designed to make it more difficult for one physician to dominate both the care and documentation of vulnerable patients. This includes better electronic record-keeping, stronger coroner review processes, and more centralized surveillance of unusual patterns in patient deaths. Yet, as authorities and families repeatedly note, the trauma left by Shipman's crimes cannot be erased simply by new paperwork. Memorializing the victims and moving forward. Memorials to Shipman's victims, most of whom were elderly women, aim to remind future generations that every lost life was far more than a number or a demographic. Individual stories, family photos, and community events drive home the scale of the betrayal. Survivors and the wider public continue to grapple with difficult emotions, outrage, regret, and often lasting distrust of those in positions of authority. The fact that the youngest confirmed victim was only 41 years old acts as a further warning. No group is truly immune, and no sequence of crimes can be thoroughly explained away by a single pattern. If Shipman's atrocities began and ended with elderly women, they would still horrify. That his actions extended even further only magnifies the urgency of vigilance, robust oversight, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those most at risk. Ultimately, in reflecting on who Shipman killed, we must also consider why the patterns went undetected for so long, and what it means for medical ethics, community trust, and our collective responsibility. Whether the victim was a frail widow or a younger man quietly trusting his doctor, the message is clear. Power, when unchecked, can turn deadly, and every system must be built not just for the predictable, but also for the unthinkable. How Shipman used death certificates to evade suspicion for years. The chilling story of Harold Shipman's crimes is forever intertwined with the issue of death certification, a loophole that allowed him to continue his killing spree in plain sight for decades. Looking back, it's difficult to fathom how one man could manipulate a system meant to ensure the dignity and safety of patients at their most vulnerable. Yet Shipman's medical authority, his social standing as a beloved family doctor, and his access to the very documents that made or broke suspicion, all merged to create the perfect cover. To really understand why Shipman was able to evade suspicion for so long, you need to grasp the power that the death certificate confers on a physician in the UK. At the most basic level, a general practitioner is responsible for assessing the circumstances of a patient's death, certifying the cause, and writing it down on the official document provided to families and authorities. For elderly or already frail patients, an unexpected passing in their own home often prompted little more than sadness and acceptance. The doctor, especially someone with Shipman's reputation, was rarely ever doubted. His word was considered final. Shipman used this to his advantage countless times. By being the sole certifying figure in so many of his patients' deaths, he had the final say about what happened during their last moments, in effect closing the book on any investigation before it could even begin. He could attribute deaths to plausible causes like heart failure, strokes, pneumonia, or simply old age. Because he was their longtime GP, few questioned the accuracy of his assessments. In many cases, families even felt comforted that the trusted family doctor had been the one to support them through such a painful moment. This trust created a near-total barrier to external scrutiny. Coroners rarely became involved because UK law required a death to be reported only if it was sudden, violent, or from unknown causes. Most of Shipman's victims were elderly, and he meticulously selected medical explanations that matched prior histories, either invented or inflated in his records. Most deaths seemed entirely unremarkable in the eyes of the system. The process of issuing a death certificate in the UK, especially in small communities like Hyde, was straightforward and alarmingly vulnerable to abuse. Doctors would visit the deceased at home, fill in the necessary paperwork, and send a copy to both the family and the local registrar. If the deceased appeared to have had a chronic illness, little more was required. In the absence of obvious foul play or a challenge from relatives, the whole thing could be wrapped up in an afternoon. Shipman, with his calm authority, rarely left room for doubt. He often reassured grieving family members that their loved ones had passed peacefully or without pain, subtly guiding them to accept his provided explanation without further inquiry. Over the years, as the number of deaths in Shipman's care increased, there were a few quiet whispers in the community. Some undertakers and nurses noticed that Shipman's patients seemed to die at home more frequently than most, yet no official alarms rang out. Why? Because each death came neatly packaged with a plausible cause and all the right paperwork. Death certificates not only kept authorities at bay, but also shielded Shipman from deeper investigations by other doctors or regulatory bodies. No matter how many funerals followed Shipman's visits, the chain of trust remained unbroken by the very documents intended to safeguard the public. The emotional weight of this fact is overwhelming. Families grieving for their lost parents, grandparents, and spouses never realized that the final signature on the death certificate was, in many cases, a shield protecting the very man who caused their pain. The system trusted Shipman to investigate himself. In doing so, it left the door open for unimaginable abuse, perpetuating the illusion that every passing in his care was the result of natural decline. It's important to note that death certification practices in the era were built on the assumption that medical professionals were, almost invariably, honest. Regulation focused more on the risk of communicable diseases than on the threat of intentional harm by a caregiver. Added to that, small-town dynamics made it nearly taboo to question a physician's judgment in matters as sensitive as death. Shipman's strong relationships in Hyde allowed him to retain control over the narrative in every case, a privilege that would eventually become his undoing, but only after decades of tragedy. One major reason the pattern went unnoticed was the unspoken, often bureaucratic trust between the medical community and registry authorities. Shipman's paperwork was admired by some colleagues for its thoroughness, ironically the very quality that revealed his duplicity years later. On paper, he seemed to be a model practitioner, attentive, detail-oriented, professionally cautious. The deaths he certified did not stand out when examined individually. Only when viewed together did the anomaly, too many deaths among his patients, too many natural causes, become clear. Before the Shipman case, the broader system for monitoring deaths in the UK was alarmingly decentralized. Local registrars, overwhelmed and often under-resourced, had few means of noticing trends outside normal seasonal upticks for illness or old age. Individual deaths, rarely flagged unless accompanied by dramatic or suspicious circumstances, disappeared into a sea of routine paperwork. Relatives, grieving and unfamiliar with medical nuances, had little reason or ability to challenge the cause of death listed. In essence, the structure depended upon shared faith in the system and those running it. Meanwhile, Shipman's clinical authority lent credibility to every claim he made. He could refer to previous notes on a patient's long-standing heart complaint, simply amplify otherwise minor symptoms, or even create false evidence in files that no one would likely examine. His command of the medical terminology, plus the natural complexity of treating elderly, frail patients, made his explanations appear not only logical but inevitable. The line between a natural end and a manipulated outcome was, under his management, completely blurred. What stands out is just how easily the ordinary machinery of death registration was exploited. In theory, multiple checks existed: relatives, undertakers, registrars, sometimes nurses. But in real life, all these parties deferred to the doctor's expertise, especially when that doctor was a long-standing fixture in their community. Suspicion, if it existed at all, was almost always suppressed by social norms and the overwhelming hope that no one in such a position would ever commit such evil. In rare moments, undertakers, trained by experience to spot the unusual, did raise eyebrows at the steady stream of bodies certified by Shipman, but even these concerns rarely made it past informal conversation. Without a formal complaint or hard evidence of misconduct, authorities had little to act on. This lack of escalation persisted until a set of circumstances so odd finally motivated deeper inquiry: a suspicious will, a pattern of similar deaths, or perhaps a family member who refused to accept a given cause. Eventually, it was bureaucratic paperwork, the very system that had shielded Shipman, that helped bring about his downfall. Investigators, following up on odd signatures and an unusual number of cremations, cross-checked patient lists with death records and began to see the statistical outlier that Shipman had become. The horror, when fully revealed, led to an enormous reckoning within the UK medical and legal communities. How could a single doctor sign off on so many deaths without sparking intervention much sooner? The Shipman case prompted a sea change in the way death certificate protocols were viewed and enforced. Authorities realized that the ability for any single practitioner to dominate every stage of a patient's final chapter, prescribing, treating, certifying, and recording, presented a critical conflict of interest. New procedures demanded that a second health professional independently review unexpected deaths, especially in situations where a single doctor had managed both care and certification. The entire process became far less reliant on individual trust and far more on documented checking, oversight, and family involvement. For the public, the realization that a respected and popular doctor could quietly manipulate the very documents intended to provide safety and comfort was deeply traumatic. Families were left with haunting doubts about whether their own loved ones had died naturally or had been victims of an unfathomable betrayal. Community trust in the medical profession suffered, and conversations about patient rights, checks and balances, and physician accountability became urgent topics across the country. Today, the phrase death certificate in the context of Shipman's crimes invokes more than bureaucratic finality. It represents both the blind spot that let a predator operate unchecked and the painful lessons learned at such terrible cost. His years of issuing death certificates for the very people he killed stands as one of the most damning reminders of the need for constant vigilance, even in the most trusted of hands. The assumption that a trusted family doctor would be among the least likely individuals capable of committing heinous crimes was deeply rooted not only in the psyche of the authorities, but throughout all of British society during Harold Shipman's years of practice. This premise carried enormous influence over the way his actions went undetected for so long, and is a chilling testament to how dangerous unchecked trust in authority can become. From the outset, the role of a general practitioner, GP, in Britain, carried with it a sense of almost unassailable authority and benevolence. Family doctors were pillars of their communities. Their responsibilities stretched beyond merely prescribing medicine or diagnosing ailments. They often delivered babies, saw entire generations through illnesses, and provided comfort in people's final days. This continual, intimate involvement in the cycles of family life bred an environment where respect, deference, and unquestioned faith in medical professionals became second nature for patients, law enforcement, and even regulatory bodies. When early signs of irregularities began surfacing around Shipman, they were met with disbelief or rationalizations. Under normal circumstances, a spike in patient deaths, or even a single unexpected fatality, might prompt scrutiny, especially if a healthcare worker was involved. However, in Hyde and similar towns across England, the notion that someone of Shipman's social standing could be responsible for murder was simply unthinkable. As a doctor, he was presumed both competent and compassionate, two qualities that seemed fundamentally incompatible with the idea of deliberate harm. This foundational belief shaped not only community responses but also investigative priorities. Authorities, for their part, were susceptible to their own biases and cultural preconceptions. When an undertaker or a nurse quietly expressed concerns about the high mortality rates among Shipman's patients, those warnings were brushed aside or explained away. Police, coroners, and even senior health administrators operated under the assumption that doctors, especially family doctors, were inherently trustworthy. The idea that a physician would exploit his unique position to actively cause harm was so far outside the boundaries of the expected that many simply discarded it as impossible. This phenomenon wasn't limited to Shipman's case, but rather is indicative of a wider pattern of institutional thinking. Systems designed to monitor professional behavior in medicine and other high-trust roles were originally built around the expectation of good faith. Reviews were spot checks, not designed to catch the calculated cunning of someone intent on systematic abuse. Shipman understood this, and he played into it masterfully. Each time a life was lost under his care, he was given the benefit of the doubt, not out of neglect, but a deeply held belief that the doctor was always, by definition, a protector. The legal and regulatory landscape at the time further reflected this perspective. The frameworks governing discipline and oversight relied heavily on peer review and complaint-driven investigations, processes that only kicked into gear if peers or patients raised their voices. With Shipman, his immediate circle included elderly patients likely to die of natural causes, and their relatives, often themselves grieved or overwhelmed, rarely questioned his explanations. Even when multiple deaths began to form a pattern, the idea that the common denominator could be the physician himself took immense effort for both colleagues and authorities to entertain. In police investigations, confirmation bias played a significant role. Investigators assigned to look into Shipman's practice would often collect the available facts but process them through the filter of their assumption. Shipman was a respected member of the community and a trusted medical expert. When asked to account for unusual patterns, such as the high number of at-home deaths or patients dying shortly after visits, Shipman's calm manner and plausible medical justifications seemed to allay doubts. Officers, lacking medical expertise and socialized to respect doctors, tended to accept his explanations as credible and moved on. This culture of deference extended into the courtroom and the press as well. Journalists who first reported increased mortality in his patient list faced skepticism, and legal experts found it hard to press for further inquiry without what would have been considered extraordinary evidence to support such seemingly wild allegations. Defense attorneys argued, sometimes successfully, that doctors simply faced more exposure to death and, statistically, anomalies could occur without criminal intent. With no obvious alternative suspects and weak precedent for such crimes, the default position was to assume innocence on the part of the physician. The tragic consequence of this trust was the creation of an almost impenetrable barrier to early intervention. The medical board, the police department, and families themselves were all slow to suspect Shipman, even as the patterns grew undeniable. It required courage and exceptional persistence from certain individuals, undertakers, some medical professionals, and grieving family members, for suspicions to be taken seriously, and even then, institutional reluctance was fierce. Shipman's ability to weaponize his profession's social standing stands as a grave warning about the risks of unchecked authority. No matter how much a community values and relies on its caretakers, there must be mechanisms for accountability that do not depend solely on reputation or appearances. The psychological reluctance to consider those in trusted positions as capable of evil allows the very worst actors to thrive undisturbed. In the end, authorities' assumption that a family doctor would be among the last to commit monstrous acts allowed Shipman to operate with near impunity. The resulting tragedy ultimately forced police, the medical profession, and lawmakers to confront uncomfortable truths about the dangers inherent in blind trust. Today, vigilance, regular audits, and skepticism, tempered with respect, are a necessary legacy of the painful lessons Shipman's crimes forced into the public consciousness. For years, the seemingly routine nature of deaths under Harold Shipman's care lulled both families and fellow professionals into a false sense of security. It wasn't until as late as 1998 that the first serious doubts about Shipman's conduct began to surface, an astonishingly long period in which his actions went unquestioned. The catalyst for this suspicion came not from within the official structures designed to protect public safety, nor from families who so often accepted the death of an elderly loved one as a sad but natural event, but from the keen observations of a local undertaker, someone whose own profession made him intimately familiar with the patterns of mortality and loss in the community. The town of Hyde was small enough that trends, especially ones involving mortality, rarely went unnoticed. The undertaker handled most of the funerals in the area, and, over time, he began to detect what other residents and authorities had missed: a disproportionately high number of deaths among Shipman's patients. It wasn't just the frequency of deaths that was unnerving, but their circumstances. A significant number of elderly individuals who, according to family stories and the undertaker's own experience with the deceased, had seemed relatively stable or even in good spirits shortly before their sudden passing. These patients often died at home, unattended by other medical staff, and always with Dr. Shipman's calm assurances, followed promptly by the customary paperwork that certified their cause of death as peaceful and unremarkable. The undertaker's professional intuition kicked in. Handling death on a daily basis, he could differentiate between the typical ebb and flow of natural causes and the unsettling spike associated almost exclusively with patients under Shipman's care. The undertaker was particularly troubled by how frequently Shipman himself was present at the moment of death, or was the last person to see the patient alive. After discussing his observations with several local colleagues, other undertakers, some nurses, and funeral directors, he realized he was not alone in his quiet unease. Rather than dismissing these doubts, the undertaker chose to act. He compiled a list of recent deaths for which Shipman had been the attending physician and began reviewing death certificates, funeral arrangements, and his own recollections. The data made it harder to ignore the stark pattern. Shipman's name appeared with alarming regularity. Furthermore, the majority of these deaths had occurred at home, with scant independent medical documentation to corroborate Shipman's version of events. Feeling a professional and moral duty, the undertaker approached the local police. He presented them with his findings and detailed the disturbing trends he had noticed. For the police, trained to deal with overt signs of criminal conduct rather than subtle statistical anomalies, the suspicions initially seemed difficult to verify. After all, on paper, every death appeared to have a plausible, natural explanation, signed off by a respected medical authority. Yet the sheer volume and circumstances made the possibility of coincidence feel remote. The approach of a funeral professional rather than a family member or medical colleague was, in itself, significant. It highlighted how effective Shipman's system of control had been. Doctors respected his credentials, and patients mourned, but rarely questioned. Only someone whose daily work involved following up on the aftermath of deaths noticed the web being spun around the community. This confrontation required immense courage and persistence. It is easy to underestimate the risk in challenging a well-established doctor in a close-knit town, where professional reputations are fiercely guarded. The undertaker nonetheless documented his concerns carefully, providing local law enforcement with not just numbers, but tangible cases and anecdotal context. Some families had expressed mild surprise or confusion at the swiftness of their relatives' decline, but seeing Dr. Shipman's signature on the documentation had always seemed like the final word, discouraging further inquiry. As police began their preliminary inquiries, they too found themselves at a crossroads between community trust and mounting anomalies. The process of reviewing medical records, death certificates, and Shipman's clinical logbooks was complicated as much by professional etiquette as by bureaucracy. Many hesitated at the prospect of publicly questioning a family doctor with such a long, trusted reputation. Yet the seeds of doubt planted by the undertaker's observations could not be ignored. The authorities set about looking for statistical patterns and searched for any red flags that might have been invisible when seen only as isolated events. Investigators requested additional documentation and began comparing the rates of patient deaths among local practitioners, an exercise almost unprecedented in British primary health care at the time. Though Shipman was initially able to provide convincing explanations for each individual case, drawing on plausible diagnoses, carefully constructed medical histories, and his unassailable bedside manner, the wider pattern was troubling. Some police officers felt an increasing sense of duty, compelled by the undertaker's persistence to push beyond the boundaries of typical trust in the medical profession. This moment marked a crucial turning point. The vigilance and experience of an observant undertaker succeeded where institutional checks and balances had not. It was the beginning of the unraveling of Shipman's facade and the slow, methodical process of uncovering one of the greatest breaches of trust in modern medical history. Without this intervention, it is possible Shipman's crimes might have gone undiscovered far longer, emphasizing the extraordinary importance not just of professional oversight, but of noticing and questioning the impossible patterns that, when ignored, can conceal the unthinkable for years. In the wake of mounting concerns brought forth by the local undertaker, and echoed in parts by certain nurses and funeral directors, one would expect robust vigilance from law enforcement. Yet the first official police inquiry into Harold Shipman's medical practice produced an outcome that would haunt the institution and the community for years. Despite credible observations about the unnaturally high mortality rate among his patients, police investigators determined that there was insufficient evidence of wrongdoing or criminality. As a result, Shipman was not only cleared but quickly reinstated to continue his work as the trusted family doctor in Hyde. The police inquiry process was hampered by a combination of cultural, procedural, and informational barriers. For starters, police officers were not medical specialists. They lacked the forensic expertise and detailed understanding of palliative care or geriatric medicine required to accurately assess if a death, signed off as natural by a doctor, was anything more than it seemed. Reviewing Shipman's records, officers saw well-kept documentation, files that matched standard expectations, diagnoses that fit the patient's advanced ages, and symptom histories that could be rationalized. Shipman's methodical note-taking and calm explanations helped build a case for his professional competence rather than raising new doubts. The prevailing social attitude at the time played a decisive role. There was an ingrained reluctance to suspect a doctor, especially one known for decades in the community, of intentional harm. Law enforcement often deferred to the authority and presumed integrity of medical professionals. Shipman, with his steady demeanor and unblemished public reputation, was readily believed. No one relished the prospect of accusing a beloved physician of something as unthinkable as murder without incontrovertible proof. Moreover, systematic gaps in the regulatory system meant that no comprehensive or multi-agency audit was triggered by an abnormal cluster of deaths. Police did not have automatic access to cross-reference the mortality rates of different doctors or spot the statistical outliers that, when viewed collectively, hinted at something gravely wrong. Each death, examined in isolation, seemed regrettable but plausible. Older patients, many with chronic ailments, succumbing to the natural course of illness or old age. When the police completed their inquiry, they concluded there was simply not enough evidence to proceed. There was no explicit physical proof of wrongdoing, no autopsies revealing suspicious substances, no eyewitnesses, and no overtly criminal paperwork. The possibility that a string of natural-looking deaths could mask homicide was, at the time, regarded as so improbable as to be dismissible. Tragically, this investigative blind spot enabled Shipman to return to practice with his reputation intact, if anything, reinforced by the public exoneration. Families who had harbored vague doubts were silenced, and Shipman himself grew bolder, knowing that oversight was weak and suspicion unfounded. The effects of this failure were devastating. More deaths followed, each cloaked in the same aura of medical inevitability. This phase in the Shipman saga ultimately forced a reckoning with the way criminal investigations intersect with the healthcare system. The inquiry's shortcomings highlighted the dangers of excessive deference to medical authority, the critical need for interdisciplinary expertise in suspicious death probes, and the importance of building automatic safeguards that do not depend solely on individual vigilance. In many ways, the first police investigation that cleared Shipman did not just allow further tragedy, it fundamentally altered how institutions relate to one another and how whistleblowers are listened to when the stakes are life and death. For more than 2 decades, Harold Shipman operated with chilling impunity. Even after the initial police investigation cleared him to return to work, the true extent and reality of his crimes remained under the surface. Everything changed in 1999. With a single act of greed that would finally unravel the careful mask Shipman had worn for years. The events that led to his exposure would not begin with detailed forensic breakthroughs or suspicious mortality statistics, but with the daring forgery of a recently deceased patient's will, a move that revealed both his hubris and his vulnerability. The patient in question was Kathleen Grundy, a well-known member of the Hyde community. At age 81, she was remarkably active, a former mayor, tireless charity worker, and beloved mother. When her life was abruptly cut short, there was some initial sadness, but few public questions about her well-being prior to her death. After all, the explanation provided by her trusted family physician, Dr. Shipman, seemed as plausible as ever. The difference this time, however, was money, and paperwork that didn't quite fit. After Grundy's death, her daughter, Angela Woodruff, an esteemed attorney herself, began settling her mother's estate. She was shocked to discover a will, supposedly signed by her mother, leaving almost her entire fortune, amounting to approximately £386,000, nearly £500,000 today, not to her family or favorite charities, but directly to Dr. Harold Shipman. The document's language was stilted and uncharacteristic, and the signature didn't match other legal paperwork Grundy had completed over the years. For Angela, alarm bells rang immediately. Unlike many families Shipman preyed on, the Grundys had professional knowledge, confidence, and access to legal channels. Angela, deeply suspicious, took the will to her legal partners and the authorities. She also had her mother's body exhumed and underwent a second post-mortem, something unprecedented among Shipman's hundreds of prior victims, whose deaths had been rapidly certified and led to burial or cremation without question. During this examination, forensic scientists found morphine in Kathleen Grundy's system, despite no medical justification for such a drug to be administered. The implication was plain. She had been poisoned prior to her death, and Shipman, who both prescribed and recorded the doses, was at the center of it all. The forged will, which was almost laughably transparent to legal professionals but might have fooled less astute families, proved the critical crack in Shipman's armor. Up to that point, he had been adept at manipulating the bureaucratic process, expertly filling out and explaining death certificates and leveraging his authority to quell questions. But the pursuit of Grundy's fortune forced him to create a paper trail that couldn't withstand scrutiny. The backdating of records, inconsistent signatures, and implausible legal phrasing all pointed to one source: Shipman himself. Police, already slightly wary after earlier concerns, now had a clear, actionable irregularity. Financial motive linked with suspicious medical circumstances. With the help of forensic IT experts, they began examining Shipman's medical records. Investigators found again and again that records for deceased patients had been altered shortly before their death, often to include fabricated symptoms or backdated notes suggesting a decline in health that wasn't supported by earlier visits or family reports. The forged will was the smoking gun needed to move beyond mere suspicion toward comprehensive investigation. As authorities dug deeper into Shipman's files, what emerged was a pattern that, in hindsight, seemed both shocking and obvious. The deaths reflected a chilling regularity, often in the afternoon, many in the presence of Shipman, victims disproportionately elderly, alone, and vulnerable, and almost all of them certified as dying, conveniently, from natural causes by Shipman himself. The focal point, however, remained that forged will. It was definitive, material evidence of criminal intent, and it gave police, prosecutors, and the public something tangible to hold on to. The scandal around the forged will also made headlines internationally. The press seized on the story of the trusted Dr. Death attempting to inherit a patient's life savings, and public outrage fueled pressure for a more sweeping investigation. Soon, a full audit of Shipman's medical and professional conduct was underway, involving hundreds of deaths spanning decades. The incident shifted the dynamic of the case from hesitant curiosity and whispers of professional irresponsibility to the harsh reality of premeditated murder for financial and psychological gain. For Angela Woodruff and her family, pursuing the truth behind the forged will was an act of courage and determination. Their unwillingness to accept Shipman's narrative finally forced accountability in a system that had failed so many others. In the end, this single act of forgery revealed the limitations of the blind trust placed in authority, the dangers of unchecked power in even the most caring professions, and the vital importance of vigilance, especially when financial interests collide with matters of life and death. The chapter of Harold Shipman's life that culminated in his sentencing and eventual suicide marked one of the most sobering reckonings in modern British criminal and medical history. After one of the most high-profile criminal trials of the era, Shipman was found guilty in January 2000 on 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming. A methodical pattern of death left in his wake, irrefutable forensic results showing lethal levels of diamorphine in victim after victim, and a trail of falsified documents and forged signatures. Public and professional response to the verdict was a mix of relief, outrage, and deep reflection. Many believe this outcome provided only a partial closure, knowing that the true scale of his crimes may never be fully known. The court was unyielding in its sentence. Shipman was handed multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never walk free again. The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Forbes, made it clear there was no possibility of parole. The egregious breach of trust and the coldly systematic nature of Shipman's murders demanded exceptional punishment. When the news broke, there was a collective sense of vindication among survivors' families, but it was inescapably somber. No sentence, no matter how severe, could bring back the hundreds of lost lives or erase the scars left behind in so many communities across the UK. In the years that followed, Shipman was held at Wakefield Prison, a high-security facility infamous for housing some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. Inside, he largely kept to himself, reportedly showing little remorse or interest in therapy. The authorities closely monitored him, yet for all the procedural safeguards, the emotional and psychological complexities surrounding such a notorious inmate were immense. Shipman's presence in the prison system became a chilling reminder of how easy it can be for society's deepest fears to manifest in real life, hidden beneath a veneer of respectability for so many years. On January 13, 2004, just a day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was discovered dead in his cell. He had hanged himself with bedsheets. The revelation of his suicide sent another shockwave through the country. There were many who felt deprived of the answers only Shipman himself might have been able to provide. Families who had lost loved ones, some with final questions about whether their personal tragedies were also due to him, others wanting at least the dignity of witnessing his lifelong imprisonment, found their hope for resolution cut short. The authorities launched an immediate investigation to confirm that there had been no foul play, and to determine whether there were procedural lapses, but the fact remained. Shipman had chosen to end his story on his own terms, denying society and his victims a full reckoning. The aftermath was a period of extraordinary reckoning, not only for family members of those confirmed and suspected to be his victims, but for law enforcement, policymakers, and especially the medical establishment. Endless commentary and analysis filled newspapers and television broadcasts as Britain tried to digest how a single doctor, trusted, beloved, respected by so many, had managed to operate as a serial killer undetected for decades. Many legal experts and psychologists speculated on Shipman's motives for suicide, facing the prospect of dying in prison, possibly fearing the stripping of his pension, which would affect his wife and family, or perhaps simply seeking to exert final control in a narrative that had so dramatically revolved around his authority. But the impact of Shipman's sentencing and suicide extended far beyond his individual life and death. Almost immediately, a massive public inquiry was launched under Dame Janet Smith, tasked with investigating how such an atrocity could have occurred and how the systems meant to protect patients had so thoroughly failed. The recommendations from the Shipman inquiry catalyzed sweeping reforms in the UK's healthcare and legal oversight. Among the most significant were stricter controls on death certifications, major changes to doctor monitoring and discipline, the creation of centralized and transparent record systems, and completely new protocols for investigating unexpected deaths in the community. The lines of accountability shifted. Doctors would no longer be allowed unchecked authority, and the assumption of benevolence was officially replaced by systemic caution and rigorous external review. The legacy Shipman left behind was complex and deeply traumatic. On the one hand, his death meant the true number of victims would always remain uncertain, along with the lingering mysteries about his psychological state and possible accomplices or warning signs missed over the years. On the other, his crimes and their aftermath permanently rewrote the medical and legal landscapes in Britain. Trust would have to be earned anew, and never again simply assumed. For medical professionals, Shipman's legacy became a cautionary tale woven into education and daily practice, a relentless reminder that oversight, accountability, and humility are not mere bureaucratic hurdles, but the central pillars upon which any trustworthy system must stand.